I've always believed that what the camera sees is more real than what we see with our eyes. Maybe that's why I stopped at that stall that day. The weather was bitter, with a ceiling of gray clouds pressing down over the old Munich flea market. Even the air seemed dusty, as if the whole city had been dipped in ash. The stall was shoved into a far corner, forgotten, overlooked. Most of its items were the kind of junk that's been sitting still long enough to grow a second skin of grime. The camera was in a faded blue velvet case, tucked off to the side like an urn no one wanted to claim. An old Leica, 1940s model, maybe. Its black paint was chipped and worn, the outer ring of the lens etched with barely legible German lettering. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers touched the metal, a chill ran straight through to the bone. Not cold like ice. Cold like history. Like touching something that had been waiting in the dark far longer than it should have. I forced a laugh. Told myself it was just the metal reacting to temperature. The man running the stall was old, eyes cloudy, vacant, like he hadn't belonged to this world in years. He only said one thing, his voice barely more than a whisper.
"Don't point it at people."
I thought it was just a joke. I paid. Dirt cheap. But when I turned back, he was gone. The stall was empty. That night, I cleaned the camera in my basement darkroom. Dust had sunk into the metal like aged spots on skin, but the internals were surprisingly well preserved. I dug up an old roll of film, loaded it in, and figured I'd do a test shoot the next day. Lena, my neighbor from across the hall, was the first person I thought of. We didn't talk much, just the occasional coffee borrowing conversation, but she had a quiet presence, soft-spoken, always polite. She wasn't into photography, but when I asked if she'd pose for a few test shots, she agreed with a shrug. I set her by the window where the light was soft and cool, perfect for aged film. I raised the camera. She looked directly at me. Her gaze was calm, natural. I pressed the shutter. That was it. But in that fraction of a second, I could have sworn her smile faltered. Like she'd seen something, not me, behind me. Later that night, under the dim red bulb of the darkroom, the images slowly bled into existence. The shadows rose. Faces formed. I lifted the first negative with tweezers, ready to move it to the fixer. And stopped. Something was wrong. Lena's face wasn't hers. Not quite. Her eyes were tilted just a little too high. Not her head, just the eyes. More whites than there should be. Like she was staring past me, above me. And the corners of her mouth twitching ever so slightly. Not a smile for the camera. Not for me. It looked like she was listening to something. Something I hadn't heard. I rechecked the negatives. Developed them again. Enlarged them. Every frame was the same. The same stare. The same almost smile. A smile not meant for the lens. A smile meant for something else. I told myself it was the age of the film. A processing glitch. Some chemical imbalance in the paper. But then, 3 days later, at dawn, the police knocked on my door. Lena had been found in her bathtub. Dead. The official report said sudden cardiac arrest. But they mentioned something odd. Something that made my hands go numb. They said her face was contorted, twisted, as if caught between terror and a forced smile. The photo in my hand slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. I didn't tell them about the picture. I didn't mention the camera. I just stared at her eyes in the photo, those upturned eyes, and the longer I looked, the more certain I became. I hadn't captured her. Something else had. Something that called to her. And she had answered. I didn't go to Lena's funeral. I couldn't. Instead, I locked the photographs in a drawer and didn't leave my apartment for 2 full days. But the camera, it was still here. I thought about throwing it away. Really, I held it in my hands, walked all the way to the trash room more than once. But every time I got close, something stopped me. A thought would rise, quiet, persistent. What if it's not just an object? What if this wasn't coincidence? What if it's a will? That idea burrowed in like a splinter I couldn't dig out. So I sat down and opened my laptop. I started digging into the camera's history, its model, its serial number, anything that might explain what was happening. And what I found chilled me to the core. Turns out, this Leica had a reputation. I stumbled across an old auction listing from 1997. The title was strange. The Ghost Eye from the War. The listing claimed the camera once belonged to a World War II combat photographer. The man was later found hanging in his darkroom, camera still set up on a tripod, pointed toward a mirror. The photo developed from that last shot was never published. It was said to show two people in the frame. But he was alone. From there, the camera resurfaced a handful of times, private collectors, estate sales, flea markets. Each time, the owner died within months. Cardiac arrest. Suicide. Seizures. I sat there for hours, cross-referencing names, death certificates, blurry auction photos. And then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started digging through my own archives, photos I'd taken over the past few years, using different cameras, different lenses. Not Lena. Not the Leica. Just my work. And that's when I found it. A photo from 2019. A stranger, a girl I'd taken a candid of in a park, laughing on a bench. But behind her, in the bushes, a shadow. Almost invisible at first. But when I boosted the contrast and sharpened the image, it came into focus. A man. Tall. Still. Wearing an old-fashioned long coat, his face blurred like smoke trapped behind glass. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. Not at the camera. At me. My skin went cold. That's when I realized maybe the subjects of these photos weren't who I thought they were. Maybe the lens wasn't just capturing them. Maybe it was capturing what was behind them. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't be in the dark. I stuffed the camera in a box and shoved it to the back of my closet, but it never felt far enough away. Coming home felt like walking into a room where someone had just left. Like it was waiting. Then I had the dream. I was back in my darkroom. The Leica was sitting on a tripod, pointed directly at the mirror. Its flash was blinking, soft, like a heartbeat. I stepped closer. In the mirror, my reflection began to move. But not like me. Its mouth was moving, forming words, but there was no sound. When I reached out to touch the camera, the reflection suddenly snapped its eyes open. The irises rolled back. And the mouth stretched into a horrible, puppet-like grin. Not a smile. A mask of a smile. As if something beneath the skin was yanking the face into place. I woke up drenched in sweat. The sheets were soaked through. And I knew what I had to do. I had to know. I had to see. So I set the camera on the tripod, aimed it at the mirror, and pressed the shutter. The sound was sharp, crisp. Too sharp. It echoed like it didn't come from this world, but from somewhere just behind the glass. Somewhere I had no business reaching into. I stood there, frozen in front of the mirror. My reflection didn't move. Expressionless. Lips taut. Like it was waiting for something, like I was waiting for something. It felt like I had made a deal. One I couldn't take back. The developing process dragged on. Longer than it should have. The red bulb overhead buzzed faintly, bathing the room in pulsing bloodlight. The air smelled of acid and chemicals, so thick it burned in my nostrils. Time seemed to stop. And then, the first photo began to surface. grainy, blurred at the edges. Exactly what I expected from ancient film stock. Until I saw him. I stopped breathing. In the photo, I stood before the mirror just as I had. Expression hollow, drained. But I wasn't alone. There was someone else behind me. A man. Tall, lean, wearing a vintage trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was nothing. A smear of darkness, a blur that refused to resolve no matter how I squinted. He wasn't standing there like a person. He looked burned into the frame, like a shadow pressed into the emulsion. Something meant to be invisible, caught, somehow, by accident. I stared at the photo. The me in the image didn't quite match the real me. The eyes were off, tilted just wrong, staring past me like they were already halfway somewhere else. And the man behind me? I swear to God. Under the soft pulse of the darkroom light, his body leaned slightly forward, like he was whispering into my ear. That was the first night I saw him. At first, it was only in dreams. I'd find myself standing alone in an empty street, fog curling around my feet. Then I'd see a shadow in the distance, long and stretching beneath a flickering street lamp. And he'd step into view. Hat, coat, that presence. He never spoke, never touched me, just walked slowly toward me, and I'd be unable to move. When I woke up, my ears would ring with a sound I couldn't describe. Not a voice, not even a breath, just the rustle of wind through torn film. Then I started seeing him while awake, on the subway across from me, not moving, at the end of my hallway, standing perfectly still, in the reflection of a window, even when no one else was in the room. He's always close, but never quite touching, just watching. And that's when I understood. It's a countdown. The moment I took that picture, I became the subject, not just in the image, but in his world. I've stopped looking in mirrors, covered every reflective surface in my apartment, even tried to destroy the negatives. But every time I approach the darkroom, I hear it. The sound of a shutter snapping, over and over, but no one's there. The camera never moved. It's not taking pictures anymore. It's finishing them. He's in my world now. And me, I'm slipping out of it. The third night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, every wall and window draped in black cloth, the room swallowed in shadow save for the dim glow of a single desk lamp. In my hands, the photograph. Edges curl from too much touching. I'd held it so many times, studied every grain, but the figure in the background never faded. He remained, not printed onto the paper, embedded, as if the photo contained layers deeper than silver and shadow, something else, something alive. Midnight. The lamp flickered. Twice. The air thickened, like just before a thunderstorm, but without the smell of rain, without movement. Just pressure. And silence. A silence that felt like the world had left. Then I heard it. Click. The shutter. Not imagined. Not in memory. Clear. Precise. But I covered every mirror, every reflective surface. Still, the sound rang out. From the other side. From inside. He was here. I stood. Walked, slowly, to the bathroom. The mirror was covered, black cloth, tied across the glass. I hesitated, and pulled it down. My reflection stared back. But I wasn't alone. He stood behind me, clearer now than ever before. Still in the coat. Still in the hat. But his face. There was no face. Just smooth, pale nothing, like sculpted wax before the features are carved in. But he was looking at me. I could feel it. Not with eyes. With presence. And breath. Slow. Hollow. Mechanical. Like bellows inhaling dust. I wanted to scream, to run. But my body wouldn't move. Only my reflection did. It raised its head, slowly. And smiled. Not my smile. Not human. A forced gesture stretched across skin like meat puppet by hands beneath the surface. That smile didn't belong to me. And in that frozen, breathless moment, the shudder again. Then darkness. When I woke, morning light spilled through the curtains. The mirror was shattered. I lay on the floor, photos scattered around me. But the camera? Gone. Not stolen. Not misplaced. It had returned. To where it always goes. I found it. At the flea market. Same blue velvet case. Same coat of dust. The stall looked identical to before, except I didn't recognize the vendor. Or maybe I did. His face was blurred, like a memory reprinted too many times. He handed the case to a young man, barely older than I was when I first found it. And he smiled. That same smile. The words left his mouth in a whisper too soft to be wind.
Don't point it at people.
I tried to shout, tried to stop him. But my lips didn't move. My voice didn't come. People walked past me, indifferent. No one saw me. I looked down. And in the glass of the vendor's display case, I saw my reflection. Standing behind the stall. Hat on my head. Coat draped across my shoulders. Eyes blurred. Smile quiet, familiar, and not mine.